But going to what you were talking about, media, social media, so perhaps fueled in part by portrayals in both mainstream and social media, lack of understanding of Islam and Muslims has also led to subtler forms of discrimination and aggressions. And you mentioned from Bill 21 in Quebec to cricket player Azim Rafiq, who spoke of pressure to drink alcohol. And actually, he also spoke of a more violent act when he had wine forced down his throat. These are all acts of marginalization and bigotry. Even the CBC program, Little Mosque on the Prairie, when it was on, has been described as having both given space to Muslim Canadians and perpetuating stereotypes and tropes. So do you have any recommendations on how public portrayals of Islam and Muslims could help in the fight against Islamophobia?
Memona, go ahead.
Memona should go first now. It's your turn now. Go first.
It's not turn. It doesn't matter.
No, go on.
Okay, so yeah, you know, when we think about public portrayals, again, there's a lot of research that's showing that this public portrayal in the media is actually impacting. So we know that Angus Reid Institute and the Canadian Race Relations Foundations did some research in 2018. And what they saw was that Canadians actually are significantly more concerned about the threat that's posed by homegrown radical Islamic terrorism than they are of white supremacists or nationalists. But then statistically, when you look at another study, Environics Institute did this in 2016, that, you know, there was a majority, 52% again, are being worried about this. And really the statistics of how many Muslim terrorist attacks that have been happening as opposed to white supremacists, there's a huge disparity, and there's only 3% of, you know, extremist activity that's happening by Muslims, as opposed to I think it was 52% happening from white supremacist groups. And so there's what's called this double consciousness, right? So we have this lived reality, we are seeing this for perhaps in the news, but we see certain things in the media and that changes. And then that has an impact, skews our perceptions, skews our behavior. And then what do we do about that? So I wanna kind of spring off of something that Judith Butler says. She does a lot of work around gender and war and these types of, and she's, I believe she's a philosopher. What she says is that frames are not immutable. The fact that frames depend on constant reiteration in order to install themselves as a reality means that they are vulnerable to being reconfigured. So we might have frameworks of reference that, you know, impact how we think, impact how we behave, impact our fears, but then those things are changeable. And we really need to start thinking about how to break that framework. We need to start thinking differently. And so part of that, I think, is thinking about the systems that we are a part of, the structures that we are a part of, and thinking about where we see our knowledge framework being situated. And what I mean by this is we live in a system that perpetuates, and it is a secular system. Right? Now, who does secularism include, exclude? What does that narrative come in the form of? I know, for example, Indigenous communities have a highly traditional oral, tradition. And I know, and I've read a lot and learned from Indigenous communities, that the secular way of thinking doesn't always mesh well with that. And that's also, I would say, from an Islamic perspective, for example, God consciousness is a large part of how we see our day-to-day lives, right? And so how do we start reimagining our realities, and how do we start kind of thinking about where our implicit biases are coming from? How do we think about, Minoo talked about, you know, the statistics, I think it's 35% of Muslims do have a graduate degree, as opposed to, I think the national average is 21%. So when you start bringing people in, you're not only bringing Muslims in to talk about Islam, Are you bringing them in to talk in other spaces of expertise, finances, corporates, sports, kinesiology, like whatever comes to mind? Are they part of all of those spaces of dialogue? And I think it's humanizing, naturalizing the presence of Muslims within all of our spaces. So I'm not only seeing a Muslim come in and out of a masjid. I'm not only seeing a Muslim participate in a dialogue when he or she has to stand up against or defend themselves when something happens to Muslims, but I'm seeing them as part of my everyday presence. I'm seeing those names. My child is picking up books from the library or reading books that have Muslim names that take place in other parts of the world. And so I think a big part of this is creating shared experiences and shared narratives that break down, as Minoo was speaking about a little bit earlier, and we create that experience of knowing rather than our experiences of knowing coming from the media, filtering down through somebody else's agenda, and then dealing with those consequences.
Nazanin, go.
Okay, sounds good. Sorry, I'm having some internet issues. I'm logging in with my phone. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you very much. The parts that I heard from Memona, I echo. That the media, I have taken some notes. The media portrayal is very, very much far behind, and the representation really shapes how we feel, and it informs and educates us in terms of our beliefs, again, who we extend humanity and compassion towards, and who we withhold that. In my work as a counselor, what I can see in terms of what I can and what I can say in terms of media portrayal is there is lots of power into shaping how these images are constructed. And what we, a lot of the time, especially for younger people, what we don't see, we cannot believe. So any children, regardless of who they are, when they cannot see diverse representation in a way that people who are Muslim or they have names who are either Arabic or associated with Muslims, when they just see them as cab drivers, restaurant owners, troubled people who are just walking in and out of mosques, that impacts the way we see ourselves. It also, in my mind, I was thinking about this today, that it also really reinforces the internalized Islamophobia, and there's lots of that. I'm coming from a country that there's lots of Islamophobia inside of the country because of how religion is actually presented. And Iran is not the only country that we have a strong feeling about Islam, and there's also generations of reclaiming the religion. Syria is another country where there's because of the oppressive governments, we see that, and then you see people who come here, and because of those media representation, we never got a chance to actually see people who are just living their lives while being Muslim, just living their lives while growing or being born a Muslim, as an identity, as any aspect of the identity. And it really reinforces the racism. And one of the other things that I wanted to add about representation and what I see in my work on the grounds, I work with LGBTQ refugees and refugee claimants, as well as newcomers and immigrants. And one of the things we see is I've never seen a representation of a queer Muslim person in media. And the impacts of that is what we see on the ground, on the front line, is that service providers who don't know how to serve, how to support queer Muslims, for example. So the media really informs what we see, what we think, what we believe, who we humanize. Diversifying it, it's going to be kind of sounding like a bit of an echo chamber when people are familiar with this. Diversity is the key, representation is the key, not repeating the voice of the oppressor. So when there's anyone like Trump or anyone else who says, so-and-so go back to your country, there's lots of amplifying of those voices of going back to country. And at one point, I would like to know if there is like someone who passes as Muslim or who is a Muslim who haven't heard that in their lives of like, go back to where you're coming from, regardless of where they're from. So we really need to have correct, diverse, and through representation, through media, through literature, from the names of it. It starts with policymakers, it starts with media, and it starts with us in terms of like the work that we do. It's very important. That's very, very crucial. It informs our education. It informs what we're curious about, who we stereotype, who we don't stereotype, who we think they don't deserve our empathy. So for example, even if you see people who have done harm, again, because this is kind of like gender-based violence is also my work, when you see who is being cancelled, like when we see Jian Ghomeshi, was like the news came out about Jian Ghomeshi, who was really being attacked for his identities, and he was cancelled, no problem. And then yet we see the commissioner for the Winter Olympics here, I forgot his name, John Furlong, I think was his name. Many claims against him by indigenous folks, but for his role in residential schools, and he's still active. He made a bid for another Winter Olympics here. So that's the power of media, who we have empathy for, who's being cancelled, even for people who are doing harm, even for cis men who are doing harm. So the media is very important, and I think there's no one here that doesn't understand the importance of this.
Okay, thank you, Memona. Thank you, Nazanin. And okay, first I have to say that I really loved Little Mosque on the Prairie. I really enjoyed it. Okay. So, and I think that there were more positive issues on Little Mosque on the Prairie than it came at a time that showing actually that Muslims and Christians can get along, and Muslims can hold their ceremonies in a church side by side a priest. I think that was a good lesson to people that I really wanted to say it. Now, my two panelists, covered almost everything on this issue. The only thing that I like to say is we were on question 3, right? Bear with me. So, yes, the media is not doing very positive things. And I actually want to a little bit pick on politicians and our political system. Meaning that whenever there is a case, for example, the case that happened in London, Ontario, okay, all of them, they poured, they came, they had black on, some of them had tears on, and then a week after, everything was done, everything was finished, nobody was talking about it. So the point is, it is the system, this is a systemic problem. And I think Memona talked about it. She said industry. I would say that this industry has its roots in every institutions that exists in Canada, in United States, in Europe, wherever, you name it, it exists. So. And our politicians are not doing anything. What they do is a band-aid solution. Band-aid solution is not going to help. This is deep. What they do is they have a visible Muslim woman or a visible Muslim man behind them, standing behind them. That's it. They are so for Muslims, they understand Muslims. That's not the way to deal with the problem. We have a very deep problem. And in order to deal with it, we have to go deeper. We have to find out what's the problem. Now, yes, Muslims should become a part of the Canadian, culture, the Canadian multiculturalism, the Canadian mosaic. They should be considered as, a citizen of the society. But how is the question? How is we started from kindergarten? We started with kindergarten teaching the kids that diversity is beautiful. Diversity is beautiful. We should acknowledge diversity. We should respect diversity. We should celebrate diversity. There's nothing wrong with that. What do we do in our schools in order to educate our kids about Islam, about other religions, about culture? We teach them the 3 F's. I say it, it's my term. The 3 F's of culture, the 3 F's of religion, which is fun, food, and festivals. That's all we do. A month of culture. You bring your own food in, or the 3 S's, sari, sati, and samosa. This is all we do at school. That's not the way to do it. I'm not suggesting go and teach the kids what Quran says. Teach the kids to respect diversity. This is what we need to do at the very young age. And now we have to do it at other levels. I teach my courses are known to be controversial at York University. I teach, for example, human rights in Islam. I teach women's rights in religion. When students come to these classes, they all bring their baggages in. And I teach academic religion. I teach academic way of looking at religion. I don't preach it, I teach it. So what do I do? My first 2-3 weeks is just to bring them to realize that they are different, and it's wonderful to be different. It's wonderful to be a Shiite in this class, to be a Sunni in this class, to be a Hanafi Sunni in this class, to be a Zoroastrian, to be a Christian, to be a Jewish, to be a woman, to be a man, to realize that they need to respect that. They need to acknowledge that, and they need to celebrate that. That is when we do something about it. That is when that, if they look at, for example, a woman with a hijab, they will say, oh, she has a hijab. It's not an important issue to them to question. Are you okay? Are you oppressed? Are you suffocated? Are you domesticated? No, it's none of these. I had students in my class 2 years ago. She had niqab. She was the most articulate student in my class. The most articulate student in my class. The niqab did not stop her. But why Bill 21? Why do we give this power to our politicians to tokenize us? It's not only Muslims that are tokenized. Sikhs are tokenized, Hindus are tokenized, Jewish people are tokenized. We don't reach any point in that sense. We just have to sit down and realize that we need to start bringing our humane nature out. We have lost it, unfortunately. We are humans. There's a poet, an amazing poet, Iranian poet. His name is Feridun Moshiri. He says, humanity is dead, but humans are still alive. we live in this environment now.